What I'm going to do is give you a background on what has been the policy of the Biden administration toward China, at least what we've been seeing in the last 2 months and a few days, and then discuss what it is that is so disturbing to the people who put Biden in office and who represent the international global establishment. What's so disturbing to them about the China Belt and Road Initiative? Now, to give us some background to that, we're going to take a look at a video from Lyndon LaRouche, which was played at the conference, but which gives you a sense of how Lyndon LaRouche and then Helga Zepp LaRouche view the ideas of physical economy that underlie the principles of the Belt and Road Initiative today.
There are some practical considerations in this, strategic ones. And you'll see that the two focal points of this conference will turn out to be at the end as they are at the beginning. The issue of Eurasian recovery, Eurasian development as the pivot for world recovery, including the role of Russia as a very special part of any such recovery effort, and the relationship of this Eurasian commitment to the contrasting situation of Africa. In other words, to understand the world as a whole in the simplest terms of reference, look at the possibility of what we can do in Eurasia, and then look at the needs of Africa in order to see humanity in its wholeness. Those who have the means to lift themselves up, and those on whose behalf, in the larger term, they must act to lift them up too. Because the idea of the general welfare, while it's a notion of government of each nation, also must be a notion of the relationships among the nations of the world. We must find a community of principle in the notion of the general welfare to unite nations for a common good. The common good is the general welfare of the nations, of the people in each, and of the community of nations as a group. It's the only chance for this planet. And in order to make this work, as has been understood for more than a century, almost a century and a half now, the only way this could be worked was to develop a system of infrastructural development which would effectively link the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean across Eurasia. Now, this is not railroads. This is not Silk Roads. These are corridors of development, corridors which run a range of, say, 100 kilometers in width, up to 100 kilometers, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, going in various directions, north, south, and so forth. Along these routes, as we did in the United States with the Transcontinental Railroad, that the area on either side of the transportation axis becomes immediately in and of itself a sustainable area of economic development. Then by that means you can branch out from the main corridors into subsidiary corridors of development and capture the area. If we make that kind of link, you have one interesting change occurs immediately. For as long as we know, mankind's economy has been dominated by the oceans. Contrary to all these theories that the British biblical archaeologists tell you, civilization did not come from inland and march down the rivers to the seas. It went the other way. Everything we know, especially the information on the internal characteristics of ancient astronomical calendars, shows that these astronomical calendars were predominantly the calendars used by a transoceanic maritime culture functioning a long period of time when most of North Eurasia was under a giant glacier for about 100,000 years. And during that period, most of what became later civilization was running around the oceans. And from the time that these maritime cultures came back into Eurasia, following the melting of the glacier about 20,000 years ago, when that began, was to move inland. And the first directions were to move along the great riverways inland, to move along the coastways close to the seas and close to the maritime traffic. And if you look at the map of the world, you'll find the characteristic of development or non-development is the lack of the ability to utilize efficiently the inland areas, the landlocked areas of the world, with the same degree of efficiency and productivity we can use the coastal areas and the chief riverways. So therefore, if you look in Central Asia, what do you see? You see, here's the heart of it. In China, you have a coastal area of China which reflects this, which is more highly developed, relatively speaking, and inland, the area is poorly developed, the population has a poorer standard of living, poor opportunities for development. This extends then into Central and North Asia as a whole. Therefore, if we conquer this area, what happens? Take a transportation alone. People will think today, who don't think, will think that ocean freight is the cheapest way to move freight. It's not true. The cheapest way to move freight is across land, not by truck. Trucks running up and down the highway tell you that the economy is being mismanaged. Too many trucks. It's not efficient. Costs too much. Intrinsically bad. Railways are much better. Integrated transport systems featuring railways, especially magnetic levitation systems, are excellent. Magnetic levitation systems move passengers more rapidly, but magnetic levitation systems for moving cargo, for freight, that is really a wonder. That's where the payoff comes. If you can move freight from Rotterdam to Tokyo at an average rate of 300 kilometers per hour without much stopping along the way, and if for every 100 kilometers of motion across that route you are generating the creation of wealth through production as a result of the existence of that corridor, then the cost of moving freight from Rotterdam to Tokyo is less than zero and can be up to 200 to 300 kilometers per hour. Now, what ocean freight system can do that? Did you ever see a large supercargo ship producing wealth while it was traveling across the ocean? And at what speed? So therefore, we've come to a turning point in technology, which have emerged over recent periods, where the development of the internal landmass of the world and the great typical frontier is Central and North Asia. It's the greatest opportunity, single opportunity, before all mankind for development. Now, this requires some revolutionary changes in the way we think about things. This means that we would be engaged in the greatest change in the environment in the history of mankind. This single project, say a 25-year or more, development of Central and North Asia in this direction, including the conquest of the tundra. The Arctic tundra is one of the great frontiers to be mastered. It can be done. Would mean a great change in the environment. Now, how are we going to decide what is good and bad about changing the environment? Well, what people think today about the environment is pretty stupid. It's wrong, doesn't make any sense, they don't know what they're talking about. And you see the kind of education you get, it's not no wonder they believe that nonsense. Especially people with physics degrees who don't know which end is up. But the great theory of the environment was established by a Russian of Ukrainian credentials, Vladimir Vernadsky, with his concept of geobiochemistry. See, what you're taught, the problem here is you're taught in most universities and elsewhere about science is nonsense. It's a damn lie, most of it, to put it frankly. What you're taught as basic physics is mostly a lie. Because we know from, as Vernadsky demonstrated this in his own way, and others have known it and shown it, that there are actually three principles involved in man's physical relationship to the earth and the universe. Three categories. One, the category we call non-living processes, what most people who aren't well educated call physical processes. Yeah? The second one, which some people don't understand, those in molecular biology, they refuse to understand it, it's called the principle of life. You will never get life out of a non-living process. Life is, as Pasteur insisted, is a principle unto itself. But how it's a universal physical principle, which, as Vanadsky demonstrated with his biogeochemistry, is that the history of Earth is what? The oceans and the atmosphere were produced by living processes. Down several kilometers in the Earth's surface, most of the Earth that we are in touch with as humanity was created as a byproduct of living processes. What Vanadsky calls the natural products of the biosphere. We can measure it. We can measure the power of the biosphere over the non-living process. We can measure it. Living processes are superior to non-living processes. They're more powerful. They're apparently weak, but their long-term effects are more powerful than the short-term effects of the non-living processes. Now, there's a third thing, which, again, Kant won't let you know. Immanuel Kant. That's why they call him Kant, because he can't do anything. If you believe him, you can't do anything either. The essential nature of man is that we are capable of making discoveries of universal physical principle, discoveries we can validate in known experimental ways. By applying these principles, we increase our power in the universe in ways that can be measured physically per capita and per square kilometer. We can measure this in terms of the demographic effect of this kind of action. That is, does the human species improve its life expectancy, its power to exist in the universe as a result of this? Yes, it does. That's good. Mankind actually is primary mastery of nature has occurred in terms of man's mastery and development of the biosphere. So actually, the biosphere is including what we call basic economic infrastructure, such as waterways, power systems, transportation systems. These are the development of cities, of good cities at least. These are natural products of cognition which are reflected as improvements in the biosphere. The biosphere is weak. It is stupid. It does not know how to deal with the deserts it has. It does not know how to deal with the tundras. It does not know how to deal with other problems that it has. But we as human beings can come to our poor, stupid slave, the biosphere, and say, we will educate you and we will make you stronger and better. So mankind intervenes in the biosphere to make the biosphere better. And so the principles of discovery, the application or discovery of principles applied to the environment creates the natural products of cognition in the biosphere, which improves the biosphere, which increases the potential for human life. So this is not a mysterious, arbitrary area. This is an area of science. It's an area of scientific precision, which would mean that the job to do is not to say, is it good or bad to tamper with the environment? It's very good to tamper with the environment if you know what you're doing. But you have to develop the science of water management, the science of transportation, the science of reforestation, the science of how to change and control the atmosphere and the climate. And that's what you can't make big mistakes. These mistakes will live with you for a quarter century or longer. You can't make big mistakes. Therefore, you have to have competent people, competent groups of people making the determination of how we do this. But by changing the biosphere of Central and North Asia and changing the biosphere in the arid areas of China and so forth, we will create the greatest boon for humanity in any part of this planet. What we need is a task-oriented mission task force to undertake the policy planning for precisely this, and it must be international.
What I intend to present to you today is why it is that what you just heard from Lyndon LaRouche is what is driving the fear of the Anglo-American imperial establishment, not the fear that they have of an aggressive Chinese military or a so-called autocratic regime in China, anti-human rights policy from China, all the nonsense that they throw up as their explanations for why we must be afraid of China and must mobilize against it. What they're afraid of is that what the Chinese are undertaking with their Belt and Road Initiative is a realization of the basic principles of science, philosophy, and economics that you just heard from Lyndon LaRouche, which is the revolutionary change of the world out from under an Anglo-American imperial doctrine of geopolitics and neoliberalism, but into an era of peaceful cooperation and economic development. Now, let me just begin with what the actual Biden policy is and what we've seen since he's been inaugurated. First, you had a series of meetings in Asia with the so-called Quad countries. This included meetings that Blinken, the Secretary of State, and Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, had with their counterparts from Japan, from Australia, and what Austin, the Defense Secretary, had with India, to pull together what they call the Quad, a potential military alliance to contain China, and to merge this with what is being done now to push NATO into the Indo-Pacific region, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization being deployed into the Indo-Pacific. An element of this was Blinken's trip to Brussels this last week, where he met with leaders of the European Union and with NATO, and supposedly reaffirmed their commitment to act together with the United States to contain China. An element of this was the United States, the United Kingdom, the European Union, and Canada agreeing to sanctions against China over the so-called human rights violation of the Uyghurs. And there's ample evidence to show that there is no human rights violation going on in Xinjiang province. Maybe we can get to that in the Q&A, but the story is a fraud cooked up by the same networks that claim that the Assad government was using chemical weapons against its own population. It's from the British Foreign Office as false flags as part of their assault against China. Now, in particular, I'm just going to review very briefly some documents that have come out in the last days from a group of think tanks that are essentially mouthpieces for the military-industrial complex, funded by corporations, funded by the Foreign Office of Britain, by the US State Department, by the Soros networks. These three institutions are the Atlantic Council, the infamous Council on Foreign Relations, and the Center for New American Security. The Atlantic Council put out something on January 28th called the Longer Telegram, which was drawing upon the initial long telegram from 1946, which laid the basis for the Cold War, as a strategy for containing China today. And it argues that, in particular, what should be done is to use a laser-focused drive to split the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party away from Xi Jinping. In other words, to conduct regime change operations inside China explicitly. That was in the Atlantic Council's document, the Longer Telegram, which came out on January 28th, just a week after Biden was sworn in as president. The Atlantic Council put out another one on March 22nd called the China Plan, a transatlantic blueprint for strategic competition. And again, this lays out in more detail what can be done to not just contain China, but to prevent it from succeeding with new alliances for development. And I'll go through some of the details of that in a moment. The third report was on March 25th from the Council on Foreign Relations, which was originally established in 1921 as an American, British, think tank to coordinate the activities, the diplomatic activities of the US and the United Kingdom after World War I. Now, it continues to carry out the same function today, and on March 25th, it put out a report titled China's Belt and Road Initiative, Implications for the United States. Now, the third one, the Center for New American Security, it has constant seminars, forums, and puts out reports that are read by people in Washington. These three institutions are really largely responsible for shaping the discussion that goes on in the Congress and within the so-called permanent bureaucracy. Now, just to give you a sense of who the four people most important in making policy for Biden on China, you have Secretary of State Blinken, you have National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, you have the Asia czar at the National Security Council, Kurt Campbell, who is largely responsible for Obama's pivot to Asia, and then a man named Eli Ratner, who heads the China Task Force in the Department of Defense. And these four people have been with Biden, at least the first three have been with Biden, since his time on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee at the beginning of this century. Ratner's been involved with them on and off since about 2010. But the four of them are critical figures in the development of the China policy. At times, they present themselves as opponents of the neoconservatives, as a sort of softer version. Whereas Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz and the military are essentially saying, build up the forces, get ready to go to war. These guys say, well, war is not the best option. But their approach could best be characterized as a carrot and stick approach. Now, Blinken was a partner with Michelle Flournoy, who was the original choice to be the defense secretary, but because of her blatant involvement in the military-industrial complex, they had to drop her. But the two of them formed something called the West Executive Advisors LLC, which was a very important think tank set up in 2017 to, again, shape policy. It included a number of alumni from the Obama State Department and National Security Council. But let's go back a little earlier. Flournoy, in 2007, was the co-founder with Kurt Campbell of the Center for New American Security, which has in its board a number of people who are certified neoconservatives. For example, Victoria Nuland, who was the operative on the ground in Ukraine in 2014 for the coup there, who's a certified longtime ally of what used to be called PNAC, the Project for a New American Century, the unilateralist approach to US policy. The US is the only country that should be allowed to make the rules. When she left the Obama administration at the end of the term, she went to the Center for New American Security, and now she's coming back as the number 3 person in the State Department for Biden. Now, this group has written a number of articles in recent years. For example, Campbell and Ratner wrote something, How Beijing Defied American Expectations, in the March 2018 Foreign Affairs publication, which is the publication of the Council on Foreign Relations. What they argued is that the idea that China would change to become more Western if they were allowed into the World Trade Organization and were given a seat at the table, they argued that was naive, that China explicitly rejects Western liberal values, such as the market economy, and instead is going to continue to operate on the basis of state-driven economic policy, including with the Belt and Road Initiative, and that we have to recognize that that initial approach failed. In September 2019, Jake Sullivan and Campbell wrote an article called, again in Foreign Affairs, Competition Without Catastrophe, in which they laid out a strategy of how we could compete with China without necessarily going to war. But it starts with all the same assumptions that China is anti-democratic, autocratic, coercive, and militarily aggressive. But given that, we can still work with them. Now, in January 12th, Campbell wrote another article with a guy named Rush Doshi called How America Can Shore Up the Asian Order. I should tell you this co-author, Doshi, is with the Brookings Institute, but has written a book that's going to come out any day now called The Long Game, China's Grand Strategy to Displace the American Order. Now, the view of these four from these articles and from other public speeches they've given and other more articles than I can go through right now is that, yes, China has made extraordinary progress, especially with technology and with advancing the standards of living of their country, which is commendable. But that progress makes it a threat to the Western order, as they will not allow themselves to be integrated into the Western liberal order. This means they are, one, anti-democratic. Look at Hong Kong, they write. Look at Taiwan. Look at the threats. Look at Tibet. Number two, they suppress minorities, and this uses the fake report on the alleged concentration camps against the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province. You should know that the reason the Chinese have taken measures in Xinjiang province to address the Uyghur question is that a small grouping within the Uyghur Muslim population, a not so small network, I should say, were recruited by mosques in that area to go fight in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria against the United States on behalf of the terrorists. And then they were going back into Xinjiang province to try and undermine the Chinese government. That was the basis of the Chinese moving against it. But instead of shooting them and torturing them and blowing them up, which is what the United States did in Iraq and elsewhere, they were put in education facilities, taught trades, taught the Chinese language so they could be integrated into the society. And people who have been there to visit have said these are not concentration camps. They're more like the kinds of programs that were set up by Franklin Roosevelt for the Civilian Conservation Corps and programs such as that in the 30s. The next question. China is coercive. They have military threats against their neighbors. They use the Belt and Road Initiative to entrap nations into a debt trap and so on. And the fourth point that they make about China not being part of the Western order is they're violating the consensus on climate policy. That is, they violate the restrictions on carbon-intensive power, particularly coal, but also nuclear. That's something that's good. That's not a bad thing. So if you look at these things, you find lies, false flags, and attack on something that the Chinese are doing, which is actually correct. The real argument they make is that China is assertive in its commitment to developing its population and its business partners around the world, the other nations it's working on with the Belt and Road Initiative, while the United States has been indifferent. So here's what they argue we should do. We should offer China three options. One is we can coexist, even peacefully, provided China plays by the rules of the rules-based order. And the particular case they're going to try and trap them into is the climate issue, which is not going to work because China is not going to go along with that. Secondly, we have competition. And what they argue is that the United States should rebuild its economy, which is obvious, but should rebuild it as a way to offer alternatives to the Belt and Road Initiative, alternative financing, alternative technologies, and so on. That's what's in the new Council on Foreign Relations report that I referenced earlier. And the third option is confrontation. You build up the alliances, build up the US military to have a conscious effort to counter what they call Chinese adventurism. Now, at a recent Atlantic Council conference just last week, Senator Dan Sullivan, an Alaska Republican who is now the chairman of the International Republican Institute, which was set up by John McCain to coordinate regime change with George Soros's networks, Sullivan talked about how great it was. Now remember, Sullivan's a Republican. He talked about how great it was that Sullivan and Blinken confronted the Chinese in Alaska And he said, we now have a bipartisan consensus in the United States Congress that China is a problem and must be countered. And so what is the rules-based order that they're trying to impose on China? Well, this is the Great Reset. I won't go into the details because we've done that. That was a large part of what our conference was about. We have a new pamphlet the Schiller Institute does. It's coming out soon, called The Great Leap Backward, which goes through the whole picture of what the Great Reset is and its relationship to the Green New Deal. But it's essentially giving the power of the world's economy into the hands of central bankers acting on behalf of private banks. Pursuit of free trade agreements that will benefit the global corporate cartels, and to destroy the idea of the sovereign nation state. That's what the Great Reset is, and that's what they're trying to deploy as a means of roping China into an agreement for this. Financial regime change is what they call it. And what does that mean? It means no investment in economic production, going backwards in energy technology, so there won't be enough electricity to sustain an economy that could even support 2 billion people, much less 7 billion. And to have all of this run not through elected governments, but through technocrats working on behalf of central banks. You think the Chinese are going to accept that after the progress they've made in the last 20 years? So what makes the Belt and Road Initiative such a threat? Well, you saw in LaRouche's video how the Belt and Road Initiative, this was before the Belt and Road Initiative actually, but what this idea of a land bridge, the New Silk Road, could represent. Now, I want to just present to you the beginning of a presentation that LaRouche made in Russia before the State Duma. Dave, if we can get the poster for this, because it explains exactly how this works. He's talking about what is the special role of large infrastructural projects. The three most critical bottlenecks in physical economy are cubic meters of usable water per hour, kilowatts of power per hour, and tons, kilometers per hour in general transport of goods, each of these three and all, per capita, per household, and per square kilometer of relevant land area. These bottlenecks have an obvious bearing upon the variability of potential relative population density. That is to say, technology being otherwise equal, the effective productivity which can be developed in one area as compared to another of comparable size and general quality varies with the degree to which those three infrastructural bottlenecks are overcome. Now, he goes on to say that in order to overcome this, we must speak of development corridors. That is, not simply connectivity by rail for the sake of moving goods, but for building new areas of development along what he calls a spinal column, that 50 kilometers on either side of that spinal column, which is the rail transport and highways and other kinds of communications, you have pipelines, power transmission lines, and parallel trunk highway connections. And that the whole point of this, of the Eurasian land bridge, and this is a speech he gave in 1995 to the Russian Duma, talking about the key to the Russian economy. He said, the general problem addressed by the land bridge is that low population density tends to increase the cost of production significantly. So as you develop this, as you increase the power, the clean water, the goods transportation, and use these corridors, or have within these corridors connection points where you build new cities, new developments, that not only are you improving the distribution of goods and the production of goods, you're increasing the relative population density of the whole area. Whether you're talking about Eurasia, whether you're talking about Africa, whether you're talking about South America, Central America, even the United States. The concept of corridors of development, which he took from Lincoln's Transcontinental Railroad, is that you're changing the physical geometry of a nation. And that physical geometry includes economic development, the living standards, the educational standards, the creative potential, the productivity, and as such, people live longer and the population can grow and its standard of living will constantly increase. That's LaRouche's conception of the world land bridge. That conception is in large part what the Chinese are operating with their Belt and Road Initiative. And that's what terrifies especially the City of London and Wall Street networks that are opposing this, with the arguments that China is all the bad, has the malign intent that you see in all the publications that come out. Geopolitics, which is their theory, their doctrine, is based on fixed static systems that can be put into conflict. That is over declining raw material availability, over limited production. You can have a Darwinian universe, and that's the way you sustain imperial control, especially as a means of destroying sovereign nation states. But with LaRouche's conception of corridors of development, you transform the physical geography. It's important to note that the author of the original geopolitical doctrine, Halford Mackinder, was essentially a geographer. And his conception, which led to what we've seen recently with the Brzezinski Plan, with Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, all treats civilizations and societies as static entities which can be moved into conflict and competition with each other. Once you actually overcome that with corridors of development, you create a completely new potential for cooperation based on the principle of increased productivity, increasing living standards, and improvement of the general conditions both of governments and of people. That's the threat that instead of reducing the population as the Great Reset and the Green New Deal intend, and the intention of the people who set it up, from Prince Charles to Mark Carney to all the zero growth networks that have been publishing their documents since the 1960s, their intention is population reduction. This proposal shows what a fraud that is and how real economics works. That's why the Belt and Road Initiative is such a target for the people who are making the policy of the Biden administration, following in the footsteps of the geopoliticians like Pompeo, who destroyed the potential of the Trump administration to achieve better relations with China and Russia. And this is in the continuity going back to the post-1971 speculative system that was set in motion. So that's what I wanted to present, and I hope we can have some questions and more discussion on it.